coffee pot slipped. For half a second, Ruth Holloway watched it tilt in her grip, hot liquid sloshing toward the rim, before her left hand jerked it upright with a movement she couldn't quite control. Table 4, a truck driver named Earl who came in every Tuesday night, didn't seem to notice. But Ruth felt the tremor run through her fingers like electricity she couldn't ground. The Bluebird Diner sat at the edge of Hazard, Kentucky, where Route 80 merged with Main Street. A squat building with aqua-colored vinyl booths and a counter worn smooth by 30 years of elbows. The air inside always smelled like fryer grease, burnt coffee, and the faint sweetness of pie crust. Scents that clung to Ruth's uniform even after she scrubbed it in the shared laundromat on Saturdays. The linoleum beneath her feet was cracked in places, patched with duct tape that caught at her shoe heels during the late shift when exhaustion made her clumsy. It was 10:30 on a Thursday night in March of 1968, and Ruth was the only waitress still working. She'd been hiding the tremors for 6 months. At first, it was just her pinky finger, a small flutter she could disguise by gripping her order pad tighter. Then it spread to her thumb, her wrist, her entire hand when she got tired. Now, nearing midnight after an 8-hour shift, both hands shook if she didn't concentrate, didn't lock her muscles into stillness that made her shoulders ache. "You all right there, Ruth?" Earl called, his voice cutting through the hum of the radio playing Johnny Cash. "Just fine." She smiled, the expression she'd perfected, warm but distant, friendly but unreachable. "Pie's fresh if you want a slice before I close up." He nodded, and she turned away before he could study her face too closely. In the kitchen, she braced both palms against the metal counter and breathed. The truth was eating her alive. Ruth was 29 years old, raising an 8-year-old daughter named Caroline in a rented room above the hardware store, and every week the shaking got worse. She'd seen a doctor once, the free clinic 2 towns over where they didn't ask for payment up front, and the physician, an older man with kind eyes, had run tests she couldn't afford to follow up on. "Could be neurological," he'd said carefully, writing notes in a file she'd never see again. "You'd need to go to Lexington, University Hospital. They have specialists." Specialists meant money Ruth would never have, so she worked. Breakfast shift at the diner, then cleaning houses for the families on the hill where the mine owners lived, then back to the Bluebird for dinner and late-night service. Caroline stayed with Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who ran the laundromat, trading childcare for free washing. It wasn't ideal, but it was survival. What Ruth couldn't tell anyone, what she hid behind long sleeves and careful movements, was that she'd started dropping things. Cups, plates. Last week, Caroline's hand when they'd crossed the street. The diner's back door swung open, and Frank Cutler stepped inside, his sheriff's deputy uniform still crisp despite the late hour. "Coffee, Ruth?" She nodded, reaching for a clean mug, willing her hands steady. Frank was 35, divorced, decent enough that he always left a quarter tip, even when he only ordered coffee. He'd been coming in more frequently lately, his eyes tracking Ruth with something between concern and suspicion. "You working yourself too hard?" he said, settling onto a stool. "Bills don't pay themselves." "Nobody's saying they do." He accepted the coffee, his gaze dropping to her hands. "But you look worn out, shaking like that." Ruth's blood went cold. She'd been so careful. "Just tired," she said lightly, already turning away. "Long day." But Frank's expression had shifted into something official, something she recognized from the times she'd seen him question the men who got too drunk at Miller's Tavern. "Ruth, I'm going to ask you straight. You using anything?" Pills? Folks have been talking? The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. What folks? People notice things in a town this size. His voice was gentle but firm. Shaking hands, losing weight, working yourself to the bone. Looks like, well, it looks like what we've been seeing with the truck drivers bringing in pills from Louisville. Speed. He thought she was taking amphetamines. The accusation was so absurd it almost made her laugh, except Ruth understood immediately how it must appear. The weight loss from skipping meals to save money for Caroline. The exhaustion. The tremors she couldn't control. The desperation that radiated from her like heat. "I'm not using anything," she said quietly. "I promise you that." Frank studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but Ruth, if you need help..." "I don't." The words came out sharper than she intended. "I'm fine." She wasn't fine, and if the whole town thought she was an addict, how long before someone called social services about Caroline? Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you're finding this story as gripping as I am, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. After Frank left, Ruth locked the diner doors and counted her tips in the back office. $4.60 for 8 hours of work. She tucked the bills into the envelope she kept hidden in her bra. The envelope marked Caroline's future in her own shaky handwriting, and added it to the growing stack in the coffee can under her bed. $312 saved over 2 years. It wasn't enough for college, wasn't enough for anything really. But it was something. A start. A promise that Caroline would have options Ruth had never dreamed of. The walk home took 15 minutes through streets that emptied after dark. Ruth's room above the hardware store had a single window facing the railroad tracks, a hot plate for cooking, and a mattress she shared with Caroline. They'd thumbtacked Caroline's drawings to the walls, bright crayon landscapes that covered the water stains and made the space feel less like poverty and more like home. Caroline was asleep when Ruth climbed the stairs, her dark hair spread across the pillow, one small hand clutching the stuffed rabbit Ruth had sewn from fabric scraps. Ruth stood in the doorway watching her daughter breathe and felt the tremor start again in her left hand. She had maybe a year before she couldn't work anymore. Maybe less. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she finally collapsed onto the mattress beside her sleeping child, was that Caroline was watching her more closely than anyone realized. And that 8-year-old minds, when faced with mysteries they can't solve, start asking questions that change everything. Caroline Holloway had learned to count pills before she could read cursive. Not because her mother took them. Ruth never touched medicine, not even aspirin when her headaches got so bad she had to lie down in the dark. But because Caroline had started paying attention to what other mothers did. Mrs. Patterson next door kept a bottle of nerve pills on her kitchen windowsill. Mrs. Chen took tiny white tablets for her heart every morning at breakfast. The women who came to the laundromat talked about their prescriptions the way they talked about recipes, casual and constant. Ruth took nothing, which made the shaking stranger. It was early April now, and Caroline sat in the back booth of the Bluebird doing homework while her mother worked the dinner shift. She'd arranged her spelling words on the sticky Formica table, but her eyes kept drifting to Ruth's hands as she poured coffee 3 booths away. The cup rattled against the saucer. Mrs. Brennan, the customer, glanced up sharply. "You feeling all right, honey?" "Fine, just clumsy tonight." Ruth's smile was bright and false, the same expression she used when the landlord asked about rent. Caroline watched her mother retreat to the kitchen, watched the way she braced herself against the counter when she thought no one could see, watched the tremor that ran through her shoulders like wind through branches. Something was very wrong. The diner smelled like meatloaf and onions tonight, mixed with the young permanence of old grease and dish soap. The vinyl booth squeaked beneath Caroline as she shifted, trying to angle herself for a better view of the kitchen. Outside, the spring rain had started, drumming against the plate glass windows and turning Main Street into a river of reflected neon. "Your mama works too hard," Mr. Chen said, sliding into the booth across from her. Caroline looked up. Mr. Chen was ancient and kind, his hands spotted with age, his English still broken after 40 years in Kentucky. He came in every Thursday for the liver and onions special, always sat in Caroline's booth, always left a dime beside his plate for her to find. "She has to," Caroline said simply. "It's just us." "Your baba, your father?" "Gone before I was born." It was a fact Caroline had accepted the way she accepted rain and hunger and the holes in her shoes. Some things just were. Mr. Chen nodded slowly, his eyes sad. "Your mama, she's shake now. Getting worse?" So other people had noticed too. Caroline felt her throat tighten. "Do you think she's sick?" "I think she's scared," Mr. Chen said carefully. "Scared people, they hide things. Make things worse." The kitchen door swung open and Ruth appeared carrying 2 plates, her movements careful and deliberate. She served the couple at table 7, smiled through their complaint about the gravy, and returned to the kitchen without once meeting Caroline's eyes. That night, after the diner closed, and they'd walked home through streets that smelled like rain and coal smoke, Caroline waited until Ruth fell asleep before pulling out the composition notebook she kept hidden under the mattress. She'd been taking notes for 3 weeks. March 15th, Mama dropped a plate, said she was tired. March 22nd, shaking so bad she couldn't button my coat, pretended she was cold. March 29th, Mrs. Chen asked if Mama was eating enough. Mama said yes, but I know she gives me her portions. April 4th, today. Deputy Cutler asked Mama if she was using pills. She said no, but he didn't believe her. Caroline pressed her pencil against the page, forming words she'd heard whispered at school, words she didn't fully understand, but knew were bad. Addict, junkie, pillhead. Was that what people thought? She knew her mother wasn't taking drugs. Ruth barely took aspirin. But Caroline also knew that truth didn't matter much when people had already decided what they believed. She'd seen it happen to Tommy Morrison's dad, seen how the whole town turned against him when someone started a rumor about drinking, seen how the lie became more real than reality. If people think Mama's an addict, they'll take me away. The thought arrived fully formed, terrifying in its clarity. Caroline had heard the older kids at school talk about foster homes, about children removed from unfit parents, about the social workers from Lexington who came in dark sedans and left with crying kids. She'd seen it happen to the Weber children last year after their mother was arrested. She couldn't let that happen. The rain intensified, rattling the window frame, and beside her, Ruth murmured something in her sleep, a fragment of a dream Caroline couldn't decipher. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, her mother looked impossibly young and impossibly tired, her face pressed against the thin pillow, one hand curled near her chin. The tremor was still there, even in sleep. Caroline made a decision that would change both their lives. She would figure out what was wrong, and she would fix it before anyone could take her away from the only family she had. At school the next day, Caroline approached Miss Perry, the librarian, with a request that surprised them both. "I need books about medicine." Miss Perry raised an eyebrow. "What kind of medicine, sweetie?" The kind about when people shake and can't stop. The librarian's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. Is this for a school project? Caroline had prepared for this. Yes, ma'am. We're doing reports on different illnesses. It wasn't entirely a lie. They were doing reports, just not about illnesses. Miss Perry led her to the reference section, pulling down a heavy medical encyclopedia that smelled like dust and old paper. This might be a bit advanced for 4th grade, but you're a smart girl. If you have questions, you come ask me. Caroline spent her lunch period reading. Most of the words were too complicated. Neurological, degenerative, etiology. But she understood enough. Shaking could mean lots of things. Too much coffee, nervousness, fever. But shaking that got worse over time. That spread from fingers to hands to arms, that came with weight loss and exhaustion. That was something else. The entry that made her stomach drop was titled, Progressive Motor Disorders. She couldn't pronounce half the conditions listed, but the descriptions matched. Involuntary tremors, muscle weakness, progressive deterioration of motor control. There were pictures too, medical photographs of patients in various stages of illness, their hands frozen in unnatural positions, their faces slack with exhaustion. They all looked like Mama. Find what you needed? Miss Perry appeared beside her, her voice gentle. Caroline closed the book quickly. Yes, ma'am. Caroline. The librarian knelt down, bringing herself to eye level. If someone in your family is sick, there are people who can help. You know that, right? We're fine, Caroline said automatically, the same words her mother used. Thank you for the book. She checked out 3 volumes, carrying them home in her school bag like stolen treasure. That evening, while Ruth worked the late shift, Caroline sat at Mrs. Chen's laundromat reading by the light of the industrial dryers. The old woman dozed in her chair near the change machine, her breathing soft and steady, while Caroline cross-referenced symptoms against diseases she couldn't spell. The truth crystallized around 8:30, printed in stark black text under a heading she had to sound out 3 times. Hereditary essential tremor. Or maybe early onset Parkinson's disease. Or something worse. Something the book called rapidly progressive and currently incurable. Mama was dying. The knowledge settled over Caroline like snow, quiet and suffocating. Her mother wasn't taking drugs. She wasn't tired or clumsy or careless. She was sick with something the book said had no cure. Something that would eventually take away her ability to walk, to speak, to feed herself. Something that would kill her, probably, soon. Caroline closed the medical encyclopedia and stared at the washing machines spinning their endless cycles and understood with perfect 8-year-old clarity that she had 2 choices. She could tell someone and risk losing her mother to hospitals and social services and poverty that would destroy them both. Or she could keep the secret and help Ruth hide it as long as possible. She chose silence. But silence, Caroline was about to learn, had a price that compounded daily. And in a town as small as Hazard, Kentucky, secrets never stayed buried for long. The rumors started the way all small-town poison spreads. Quietly, between customers at the grocery store, whispered over fence lines, passed along with church bulletins on Sunday mornings. Ruth Holloway was on something. Had to be. The way she'd lost weight. The way her hands shook. The way she worked herself to exhaustion and still couldn't seem to make ends meet. Deputy Cutler had asked her directly, hadn't he? And if a law enforcement officer was asking questions, well, there must be something to it. By mid-April, Ruth could feel the change in how people looked at her. Mrs. Brennan stopped coming to the Bluebird for her usual Tuesday lunch. The women who'd hired Ruth to clean their houses suddenly had family coming to help instead. Even Frank Cutler, who'd seemed genuinely concerned, now watched her with the wary distance of someone expecting trouble. The tips dried up first, then the extra shifts, then the cleaning jobs that had kept them afloat. Ruth stood in the diner's bathroom on a Thursday afternoon, staring at her reflection in the spotted mirror above the rust-stained sink. She'd lost 12 pounds in 2 months, not from drugs, but from giving Caroline the larger portions, from skipping lunch to save money, from the way her throat sometimes closed up when she tried to swallow, because the disease was affecting those muscles too. Her hands trembled against the porcelain edge of the sink. She'd researched her symptoms in secret, taking the bus to the Lexington Library one Sunday, while Caroline stayed with Mrs. Chen, spending 4 hours reading medical journals until the words blurred together. The diagnosis she'd arrived at, the one she couldn't afford to confirm, was progressive supranuclear palsy, a degenerative neurological disorder with no cure and a survival rate of 5 to 7 years from onset. She'd had symptoms for almost a year, 6 years left, maybe less. The bathroom door creaked open, and Ruth straightened quickly, forcing a smile as Linda Morrison, one of the other waitresses, stepped inside. "Ruth, honey, I need to talk to you." Linda's voice was gentle but firm, the tone people used when delivering bad news they thought was kindness. "Frank's been talking to Mr. Hewitt. Mr. Hewitt owned the Bluebird. And he's worried about liability. If you're using and something happens while you're working, if you drop hot coffee on a customer, or worse, the diner could be sued." Linda touched Ruth's shoulder lightly. "He's going to have to let you go." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Ruth's feet. "I'm not using anything, Linda. I swear to you. I believe you, sweetheart, I do. But it doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what people see, and what they see is a woman who can't keep her hands steady." Linda's eyes were genuinely sympathetic. "Go home, take care of yourself, and maybe think about getting some help." Ruth walked out of the Bluebird Diner at 2:15 in the afternoon on April 18, 1968, carrying her final paycheck, $23 for a week's work, and knowing she'd never walk back in. The spring air smelled like apple blossoms and diesel fuel, and the main street of Hazard was busy with afternoon shoppers who stepped aside to let her pass, their eyes sliding away from contact, their conversations pausing until she was out of earshot. She'd become the town ghost. Caroline was waiting outside the hardware store, sitting on the steps with her school bag, her face carefully neutral in the way children learn when they're trying to protect their parents from worry. "You're home early," she said. "Lost my job." Ruth sat down beside her daughter, too tired to lie. "They think I'm on drugs." Caroline's small hand found hers, fingers intertwining with shaking ones. "I know you're not." "How do you know?" "Because I've been watching you." Caroline pulled the composition notebook from her bag, the pages covered in careful handwriting. "I've been keeping track. The shaking, the weight loss, when it's worse and when it's better. And I went to the library and looked it up." Ruth stared at the notebook, her heart breaking and swelling simultaneously. "Caroline, you have a neurological disease," Caroline said, her voice steady despite the tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "Something that makes your muscles not work right. It's not drugs. It's not your fault. And it's going to get worse." For a long moment, Ruth couldn't speak. Her 8-year-old daughter had done what she'd been too afraid to do, had named the monster, had looked it in the eye, had refused to turn away. "I'm scared, baby," Ruth whispered finally. "I'm so scared of what happens to you when I can't work anymore." Then we figure it out together. Caroline leaned into her mother's side, her head resting against Ruth's shoulder. You and me, like always. They sat on the steps as the afternoon lengthened, holding each other while the town moved around them, oblivious to the quiet revolution happening on the hardware store stoop. A child becoming the caretaker, a mother learning to accept help, two people choosing honesty over hiding. What neither of them noticed was the woman watching from across the street. Dr. Margaret Ellis had been driving through Hazard on her way back to Lexington when she'd stopped for gas and coffee. She was a neurologist, 42 years old, who spent most of her time at the university hospital treating patients rich enough to afford specialized care. But she'd grown up in eastern Kentucky, in a coal town even smaller than Hazard, and something about the woman and child on those steps, the visible tremor, the protective posture, the desperate love radiating between them, had stopped her cold. She'd seen that tremor before in dozens of patients, and she recognized something else too. The specific pattern of jerky, asymmetric shaking that characterized progressive supranuclear palsy, a disease so rare that most general practitioners never encountered it. A disease that was slowly being mapped by researchers like herself who were desperate to find a cure. Dr. Ellis crossed the street, her medical bag in hand, operating on instinct and the memory of why she'd become a doctor in the first place. "Excuse me," she said gently. "I'm a physician. I couldn't help but notice. Are you experiencing motor difficulties?" Ruth looked up, her face wary. "Who's asking?" Someone who might actually be able to help. Dr. Ellis knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with both Ruth and Carolyn. "I'm Dr. Margaret Ellis, neurology specialist from the University of Kentucky Medical Center. I'm not here to judge or report you. I'm here because I think I recognize what you're dealing with, and I want to offer you something most people in your situation never get." "What's that?" Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. "A diagnosis, and possibly treatment." Caroline's grip on her mother's hand tightened. "Can you make her better?" Dr. Ellis met the child's eyes and made a decision that would alter the course of medical history. "I don't know yet, but I promise you this. I'm going to try. And more than that, I'm going to teach you everything I know about this disease, because the cure isn't going to come from someone like me. It's going to come from someone like you, someone who has a reason to fight." She was speaking to Caroline. And though no one could have known it in that moment, Dr. Margaret Ellis had just found her life's most important collaboration. Not with the patient, but with the patient's daughter, an 8-year-old girl whose love would become the driving force behind one of the most significant medical breakthroughs of the 20th century. But first, they had to survive the next 6 years. And survival, in a town that had already convicted Ruth Holloway in the court of public opinion, was going to require a kind of courage none of them knew they possessed. Dr. Ellis drove Ruth and Caroline to Lexington the following Saturday in her Chrysler sedan. The three of them crowded into the front seat because the back was filled with medical journals and case files. The highway unwound through eastern Kentucky hills still brown from winter, past abandoned coal tipples and towns that looked like Hazard's sadder cousins. Caroline pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape change as they climbed elevation, while Ruth sat rigidly between them, her hands folded in her lap to hide the tremor. "How long have you had symptoms?" Dr. Ellis asked, her eyes on the road. "A year, maybe more. Started small. And you haven't seen a specialist because specialists cost money I don't have." Ruth's voice was flat, factual. "I lost my job 3 days ago. I'm a month behind on rent. I have exactly $47 to my name and a daughter to feed. So no, specialized neurological care wasn't exactly in the budget. Dr. Ellis nodded, her jaw tight. She'd grown up understanding poverty's arithmetic, the impossible choices, the way healthcare became a luxury reserved for people who could afford to be sick. What I'm offering you won't cost anything, she said carefully. I run a research study on movement disorders. If you consent to participate, all your care is covered. Examinations, treatments, medications, everything. Ruth turned to look at her fully for the first time. Why would you do that? Because I'm tired of only treating people who can pay. And because, Dr. Ellis paused, choosing honesty over diplomacy. Because you have a rare disease that we desperately need to understand better. You'd be helping us learn, and in exchange, I'll do everything in my power to slow its progression. You can't cure it. No, but I can buy you time. Time was the only currency that mattered. The University of Kentucky Medical Center rose from Lexington's landscape like a monument to modern medicine. 12 stories of white concrete and glass, gleaming in the spring sunshine. Caroline had never seen a building so tall. Inside, it smelled like antiseptic and floor wax and something chemical she couldn't name. A scent that would become as familiar to her as her own bedroom over the next 6 years. Dr. Ellis led them through corridors lined with portraits of distinguished physicians, all men, all white, their painted eyes following the 3 women as they passed. They took an elevator to the 8th floor, neurology and research, where the walls changed from institutional beige to a softer blue, and the sounds became quieter, more controlled. This is my office. Dr. Ellis unlocked a door, revealing a space crammed with books, charts, anatomical models of the human brain. And this, she opened an adjoining door, is the examination room where we'll do your initial assessment. Ruth balked at the threshold. Today, if you're willing, the sooner we establish a baseline, the better we can track progression and treatment response. Caroline took her mother's shaking hand. I'll stay with you. The examination took 3 hours. Dr. Ellis moved Ruth through a battery of tests, walking heel to toe down a taped line, touching her nose with alternating fingers, tracking a light with her eyes without moving her head. She measured the tremor's frequency with sophisticated equipment, tested Ruth's reflexes, her balance, her ability to make rapid alternating movements. Caroline watched it all from a chair in the corner, taking notes in her composition book with the same careful attention she'd given to her research at the library. Your daughter is remarkable, Dr. Ellis said during a break while Ruth rested. How old did you say she was? 8, 9 in June. She observes like a medical student. She's trying to save me, Ruth said quietly. She thinks if she learns enough, she can fix this. Dr. Ellis glanced at Caroline, who was sketching the anatomical brain model with surprising accuracy. She might be right. Not the way she thinks, but... The doctor paused. Ruth, I need to be honest with you about something. The disease you have, progressive supranuclear palsy, is rare enough that we have very limited data. Most of our understanding comes from autopsies, from studying the brains of patients after they die. We don't have effective treatments because we don't fully understand the mechanisms yet. How long do I have? 5 to 7 years from symptom onset. You're about a year in, which gives us 4 to 6 years. Ruth's voice was steady. Maybe less. Maybe. But here's what I want to propose. Dr. Ellis pulled her chair closer, her expression intense. I want to document everything about your case. Every symptom, every progression, every attempt at treatment. I want to study your brain chemistry, your genetics, your response to various medications. And I want Caroline involved in every step. Ruth frowned. She's 8 years old. She's also brilliant, observant, and more motivated than any researcher I've ever met. Ruth, your daughter is going to watch you die from this disease. That's a horrible, inescapable fact. But what if we could transform that tragedy into purpose? What if we could teach her to understand what's happening to you at a level that might, someday, help her prevent it from happening to others? The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of hospital pages echoing through corridors. Caroline looked up from her sketching. I want to learn. Sweetheart, Ruth began. Mama, I'm going to watch it happen anyway. Dr. Ellis is right. At least this way, maybe it means something. Maybe it helps someone else's mama someday. A 9-year-old's wisdom, delivered with devastating clarity. Dr. Ellis laid out the terms of what she was proposing. Ruth would receive all medical care free of charge through the research study. She'd need to come to Lexington twice monthly for examinations and testing. As her condition progressed, they'd adjust her treatment protocol, trying different medications and therapies to slow the disease's advance. In exchange, Ruth would allow comprehensive documentation of her case, including eventual brain tissue donation after death. And Caroline would be permitted to observe, to learn, to ask questions, to receive informal mentorship in neurology and medical research. There's one more thing, Dr. Ellis said. You'll need housing in Lexington. Driving from Hazard twice a month isn't sustainable, especially as your motor control deteriorates. I have a colleague with a garage apartment she's been trying to rent. I can arrange for you to have it at a price you can afford. $50 a month, utilities included. Ruth laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. I don't have $50 a month. I don't have any income at all. You will. Dr. Ellis opened a drawer, pulling out a stack of paperwork. The research study pays participants a modest stipend, $100 monthly. It's meant to compensate for time and inconvenience. For you, it means survival. The numbers crystallized in Ruth's mind. $100 income, $50 for rent, leaving $50 for food, clothing, basic expenses. It was poverty-level existence, but it was existence. What happens when I can't take care of Caroline anymore? The question Ruth had been avoiding, the nightmare that woke her at 3 a.m. Dr. Ellis met her eyes directly. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But Ruth, I promise you this. Caroline will not go into the foster system. I'll make sure of that personally. It was the promise Ruth needed to hear. She signed the consent forms with a shaking hand that made her signature nearly illegible, binding herself to a research protocol that would strip away her privacy, her dignity, and eventually her life, but would give her daughter a chance at something more. They moved to Lexington 2 weeks later, everything they owned fitting into 4 cardboard boxes in the back of Dr. Ellis's Chrysler. The garage apartment was small but clean, with a kitchen Caroline could reach if she stood on a step stool, a bathroom with hot water that didn't run out, and windows that looked onto a yard where azaleas were just beginning to bloom. Caroline enrolled at Lexington Elementary for the final 6 weeks of 4th grade. Ruth began her formal participation in the research study, submitting to tests and procedures that mapped the deterioration of her nervous system with scientific precision. And every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, Caroline would walk from school to Dr. Ellis's office at the medical center, where she was permitted to sit in the corner during examinations, to read medical journals during breaks, to ask questions that grew increasingly sophisticated as the months passed. Why does Mama's tremor get worse when she's tired? Caroline asked one afternoon in late May. Dr. Ellis looked up from her notes. considering how to explain neurological fatigue to a 9-year-old. The brain has to work harder to control movements that should be automatic. When your mother's tired, the brain doesn't have the energy to compensate for the damaged pathways. So if we could fix the pathways, then we could cure the disease. But that's the problem, Caroline. We don't know exactly which pathways are damaged or why or how to repair them. Caroline absorbed this. Her forehead creased with concentration. Then we need to figure it out. Not you need to. We need to. Dr. Ellis recognized the moment for what it was. The birth of a collaboration that would span decades. The formation of a partnership between physician and child that would eventually reshape the field of neurodegenerative disease research. But first, they had to navigate the increasingly brutal progression of Ruth Holloway's illness and the emotional cost of watching someone you love disappear by degrees. The summer of 1968 was just beginning, and with it, the hardest lessons Caroline would ever learn about love, loss, and the price of scientific progress. By October, Ruth could no longer button her own shirt. The tremor had spread from her hands to her arms, then to her neck, creating a constant nodding motion that made her look like she was perpetually agreeing with some invisible conversation. Her gait had deteriorated too. She walked with a stiff, shuffling step that made stairs treacherous and curbs dangerous. Caroline, now 9 years old and in 5th grade, had learned to help her mother dress each morning before school, her small fingers working the buttons with practiced efficiency while Ruth stood patient and humiliated in their tiny bathroom. "I'm sorry, baby," Ruth whispered one morning as Caroline tied her shoes. "For what?" "For making you grow up too fast." Caroline looked up, her dark eyes serious. "You didn't make me do anything, Mama. This is just what's happening. We deal with it." Such terrible wisdom for a child. Dr. Ellis had started Ruth on levodopa in August, a medication that sometimes helped with Parkinson's-related tremors, though its effectiveness for progressive supranuclear palsy was uncertain. The drug made Ruth nauseous and gave her vivid nightmares, but it did seem to reduce the shaking by perhaps 20%, enough that she could hold a fork again, could drink from a cup without spilling. Small victories in a losing war. The research study had expanded to include other patients, 5 more people with rare movement disorders who came to the medical center for the same battery of tests Ruth endured. Caroline had met them all. Mr. Hayward, who could no longer speak clearly. Mrs. Patterson, whose muscles had gone rigid as stone. Young Thomas Chen, who was only 19 and already losing the ability to walk. She took notes on all of them, filling composition books with observations that Dr. Ellis reviewed with increasing amazement. "You're tracking patterns I missed," the doctor said one afternoon, reading Caroline's latest entries. "Look, you've noticed that Mrs. Patterson's rigidity is always worse on Tuesday mornings. Why do you think that is?" "Because Monday nights are when her daughter visits, and emotional stress makes the symptoms worse," Caroline said. "It's in all the research. Stress hormones affect motor control." Dr. Ellis stared at the 9-year-old who spoke, like a medical resident. "You're reading the research papers I give you?" "I read everything you give me. Most of it makes sense once you learn the vocabulary." What Caroline didn't mention was that she spent her lunch periods in the school library, checking out college-level biology textbooks, anatomy guides, anything that might help her understand the disease consuming her mother. She'd become fluent in medical terminology the way other children learned baseball statistics, out of pure obsessive need. The other kids at school thought she was weird. She didn't care. By Thanksgiving, Ruth needed a walker. By Christmas, she'd fallen twice, once in the bathroom, once on the sidewalk outside their apartment, each fall terrifying Caroline with the brittle sound of body meeting concrete and the long seconds before her mother could reassure her that nothing was broken. Dr. Ellis arranged for a home health aide to come 3 times weekly, a quiet woman named Denise who helped with bathing and physical therapy exercises. But the rest of the time, care fell to Caroline. She learned to cook simple meals on their hot plate: scrambled eggs, canned soup, sandwiches cut into small pieces Ruth could manage. She learned to help her mother in and out of the bathtub, to brush her hair when the tremor made it impossible, to read aloud in the evenings when Ruth's eyes could no longer track the lines of text without involuntary movement. On Caroline's 10th birthday in June of 1969, Ruth gave her daughter a letter she'd written months earlier, when her handwriting was still legible. My darling Caroline, if you're reading this, it means I can no longer tell you the things I need you to know. So I'm writing them now, while my hands can still hold a pen. You are the best thing I ever created. Not by accident, but by grace. Every sacrifice I made was worth it to give you life, and every moment with you has been a gift I never deserved. I'm sorry you have to watch me disappear. I'm sorry you have to be strong when you should be allowed to be a child. But I'm not sorry you're learning from Dr. Ellis, because I believe with everything in me that you're going to do something extraordinary with this knowledge. Don't let my death be meaningless. Let it teach you. Let it drive you. Let it make you into the person who saves the next mother, the next daughter, the next family facing what we've faced. I love you more than words can hold. Mama Caroline read the letter sitting on the front steps of their apartment, while Ruth watched from the window, and when she finally looked up, her face was set with determination that looked far older than 10 years. I'm going to fix this, she called up to her mother. I promise you, Mama, I'm going to fix this. Ruth nodded, tears streaming down her face, and tried to smile through the involuntary tremor that had become her permanent condition. She believed her daughter, and in that moment of absolute faith between mother and child, something crystallized. A purpose that would carry Caroline through medical school, through doctoral research, through decades of failure and frustration, toward a breakthrough that would arrive too late to save Ruth, but just in time to save thousands of others. But first, Caroline had to survive the worst year of her young life. The year when her mother's decline would accelerate beyond anything the doctors had predicted, and when loving someone would mean learning to let them go. The fall of 1969 brought changes nobody had anticipated. Ruth's ability to swallow deteriorated rapidly, turning every meal into an exercise in patient concentration. Caroline learned the Heimlich maneuver from Denise after a terrifying incident with a piece of bread that had Ruth choking for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Dr. Ellis began talking about feeding tubes, about hospice care, about decisions that needed to be made, while Ruth could still communicate her wishes. I don't want to die in a hospital, Ruth told them in early November, her speech now slurred and effortful. I want to be home, with Caroline. That can be arranged, Dr. Ellis said gently. But Ruth, we need to discuss what happens to Caroline after. You promised. You said she wouldn't go into foster care. And she won't. I've already filed paperwork to become her legal guardian if you'll consent to that. Ruth looked at Caroline, who nodded silently. You'd do that? Ruth whispered. Take on someone else's child? Dr. Ellis's voice was thick with emotion. Ruth, Caroline stopped being someone else's child about 6 months ago. She's family now, mine and yours both. The legal papers were signed on November 15th, 1969, with Ruth's shaking signature witnessed by 2 nurses and a notary public who tried not to cry. 3 weeks later, Ruth Holloway stopped being able to walk. 4 weeks after that, she stopped being able to speak. And on January 3rd, 1970, at 2:15 in the morning, with Caroline holding one hand and Dr. Ellis holding the other, Ruth Holloway took her last breath in the garage apartment, where she'd spent her final year teaching her daughter that love meant fighting even when you knew you'd lose. Caroline was 10 years old, and she'd just watched her mother die from a disease she'd promised to cure. The real work was about to begin. The funeral was small. Dr. Ellis, Denise the home health aide, Mr. and Mrs. Chen, who'd driven up from Hazard, and Caroline, standing at the graveside in a black dress that Dr. Ellis had bought her the day before. The January wind cut through the Lexington cemetery, rattling the bare branches of oak trees and making the folding chairs creak against frozen ground. The pastor spoke words about eternal rest and God's mercy, but Caroline wasn't listening. She was watching the casket, simple pine, the cheapest available, and thinking about what was inside it. Not her mother. Not really. Her mother had donated her brain to science, to Dr. Ellis's research program, to the hope that studying the tangled neurons and dying cells might reveal something useful. What lay in that casket was just the shell, the body that had failed too soon, the meat that had betrayed the brilliant, loving person who'd inhabited it. Caroline? Dr. Ellis touched her shoulder gently. It's time. They lowered the casket into frozen earth, and Caroline dropped a handful of dirt onto the lid. The sound, hollow and final. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying in the 3 days since her mother's death. Had cried until her throat was raw and her eyes swollen shut. Had screamed into her pillow and torn pages from her composition books and broken the coffee cup Ruth had always used for morning tea. But standing at the grave, Caroline felt something sharper than grief crystallize inside her chest. Purpose. Dr. Margaret Ellis became Caroline's legal guardian on January 8, 1970, and moved the 10-year-old into her house on the north side of Lexington, a modest Victorian with a laboratory in the converted basement and bookshelves that lined every wall. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the left," Dr. Ellis said that first evening. "I cleared out my storage to make space for you. We can paint it any color you want." Caroline climbed the stairs, carrying the single cardboard box that held everything she owned. Her mother's letter, her composition books full of medical observations, 3 changes of clothes, and the stuffed rabbit Ruth had sewn when Caroline was a baby. The room was small but bright, with windows overlooking a garden that would bloom with tulips in spring. Someone, Dr. Ellis probably, had put fresh sheets on the bed and left a stack of books on the nightstand. Gray's Anatomy, Principles of Neural Science, the Merck Manual of Diagnosis and Therapy. Not children's books, medical textbooks. Caroline set down her box and picked up Gray's Anatomy, feeling the weight of it in her hands, studying the detailed anatomical illustrations of the human brain, the very organ that had killed her mother, the very structure she needed to understand if she was going to keep her promise. Dr. Ellis appeared in the doorway. Too advanced? No. Caroline opened to the chapter on the basal ganglia, the brain structures involved in motor control. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Mama's brain, the autopsy. When will you have results?" Dr. Ellis moved into the room, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Caroline, you're 10 years old. You just lost your mother. You don't need to think about autopsy results right now." "Yes, I do." Caroline's voice was steady, almost cold in its clarity. "That's the whole point, isn't it? Mama died so we could learn from her. So when will we know what we learned?" The doctor studied the child in front of her. Too thin, too serious, too determined. and made a decision that would define both their futures. 3 weeks for the preliminary findings. Full analysis will take 6 months. And Caroline, when I say we, I mean it. You're part of this research now, if you want to be. I want to be. Over the next year, Caroline Holloway received an education no 10-year-old had ever been given. She attended regular 5th grade during the day, but every afternoon she went to Dr. Ellis's laboratory, where she was taught to read microscope slides, to understand brain chemistry, to track the progression of neurodegenerative disease through tissue samples and cellular pathways. Ruth's autopsy had revealed what they suspected: massive neuronal death in the substantia nigra and other motor control centers, protein tangles that choked the life from healthy cells, inflammation that had spread like wildfire through delicate neural tissue. "This is what killed your mother," Dr. Ellis said one afternoon, showing Caroline a microscope slide of Ruth's brain tissue. "See these dark clumps? Those are neurofibrillary tangles, proteins that fold incorrectly and destroy the neurons." Caroline stared at the slide, at the physical evidence of her mother's suffering. "Can we stop the proteins from folding wrong?" "We don't know how yet. That's the problem we need to solve." A problem that would take decades, but Caroline had time now, had stability, had resources she'd never dreamed of when she was helping her mother button shirts in their garage apartment. Dr. Ellis enrolled her in accelerated programs, arranged for university professors to mentor her, gave her access to medical journals and research databases that most graduate students couldn't use. By age 12, Caroline was auditing undergraduate biology courses at the University of Kentucky. By 14, she was co-authoring research papers with Dr. Ellis on protein aggregation in neurodegenerative disease. By 16, she'd been accepted to MIT with a full scholarship. Her application essay, a devastating account of watching her mother die, and the promise she'd made to prevent other families from suffering the same loss. "You're going to leave Kentucky," Dr. Ellis said the day the acceptance letter arrived. It wasn't a question. "I have to. The best neuroscience programs are in Boston, in California. If I'm going to cure this disease, then you need the best training available." "I know." Dr. Ellis pulled Caroline into a hug, this brilliant, driven girl who'd become the daughter she'd never had. "Your mother would be so proud of you." Caroline was 17 when she left for MIT, carrying Ruth's letter in her suitcase like a talisman, the words memorized but still precious in their physical form. She earned her bachelor's degree in 3 years, her doctorate in 4 more, her MD in another 4, and at 28 years old, Dr. Caroline Holloway returned to the University of Kentucky Medical Center to join Dr. Ellis, now in her 60s, in running the neurodegenerative disease research program that had grown from a single patient study into a nationally recognized center. But the cure remained elusive. For another 15 years, Caroline worked 18-hour days in the laboratory, studying protein folding, testing drug compounds, running clinical trials that failed more often than they succeeded. She watched other patients die the same way her mother had died, slowly, inevitably, their families watching helplessly as the people they loved disappeared by degrees. And with every death, Caroline's determination hardened into something almost frightening in its intensity. "You need to rest," Dr. Ellis told her one night in 2003, finding Caroline asleep at her desk for the 3rd time that week. "You're going to burn out." "I can't rest. Not while people are dying from something we should be able to fix." Dr. Ellis recognized the obsession, had seen it building for 30 years, and knew that nothing she said would change Caroline's trajectory. The girl who'd promised her dying mother she would find a cure had become a woman who would sacrifice anything to keep that promise, even her own well-being. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in March of 2008, in the form of a graduate student's casual observation about a completely unrelated protein study. Caroline was reviewing data when Maya Chen, no relation to the Hazard Chens who'd helped her mother, knocked on her office door. "Dr. Holloway? I was reading about prion diseases for my thesis, and I noticed something weird. The misfolded proteins in Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease look almost identical to the tangles we see in PSP cases. Has anyone ever tried treating them the same way?" Caroline looked up sharply. "What do you mean, the same way?" "Well, there's this experimental compound, tetracycline derivative, that some researchers in Europe are testing on prion diseases. It's supposed to prevent protein misfolding at the molecular level. I just wondered if—" She didn't finish the sentence because Caroline was already on her feet, pulling up research databases, her mind racing through the implications. Prion diseases and progressive supranuclear palsy weren't related, but the mechanism, proteins folding incorrectly and spreading that incorrect folding to healthy proteins, was strikingly similar. If a compound could interrupt that cascade in prion diseases, maybe it could work for PSP too. "Maya," Caroline said quietly, "I think you might have just changed everything." The next 5 years were a blur of laboratory work, animal studies, FDA approval processes, and finally, in 2013, the first human clinical trial of what they'd named Compound 74. The results were miraculous. Not a cure, not complete reversal, but something almost as valuable: dramatic slowing of disease progression. Patients who should have died within 5 years were still alive and functional after 10. The protein tangles still formed, but at a fraction of their normal rate, giving people years of additional life. Years to say goodbye. Years to watch their children grow up. Caroline Holloway was 43 years old when she accepted the Lasker Award for Medical Research, standing on a stage in New York City, holding the prize that was often called America's Nobel. "I want to dedicate this to Ruth Holloway," she said into the microphone, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her face. "My mother, who died from progressive supranuclear palsy in 1970, and who taught me that love means fighting even when you know you'll lose. Mama, I kept my promise. This is for you." Dr. Margaret Ellis died peacefully in her sleep on a Wednesday morning in October of 2014, at the age of 88. Caroline found her in the Victorian house they'd shared for 44 years, sitting in her favorite armchair with a medical journal open on her lap, her reading glasses slipped down her nose. She looked like she'd simply dozed off while reviewing the latest research, which, knowing Margaret, was probably exactly what had happened. The funeral was large this time, packed with colleagues and former patients, medical students and researchers whose careers Margaret had shaped, families whose lives she'd saved or extended through decades of compassionate care. Carolyn delivered the eulogy in a steady voice, talking about the woman who'd taken in a grieving 10-year-old and given her not just a home, but a purpose. Not just education, but belonging. Dr. Ellis used to say that the best way to honor the dead was to continue their work, Caroline told the assembled crowd. So that's what I intend to do. For her, and for my mother, and for every patient who trusted us with their care. After the service, Caroline drove to Hazard for the first time in 44 years. The town had changed and hadn't changed. The Bluebird Diner was still there, though under different ownership. The hardware store where she'd lived with Ruth had been converted into an antique shop. The streets were narrower than she remembered, the mountains closer, the whole place feeling simultaneously familiar and foreign. She parked in front of the old laundromat, still operating miraculously. and sat in her car watching the dryers spin through the plate glass windows. An elderly woman emerged, moving slowly with a walker, and Caroline's heart caught as she recognized Mrs. Chen, ancient now but still alive, still running her laundromat at 90-something years old. Caroline got out of the car. "Mrs. Chen?" The old woman squinted, her eyes clouded with cataracts. "Yes? Do I know you?" "I'm Caroline Holloway, Ruth Holloway's daughter. You used to watch me when I was little." Mrs. Chen's face transformed, memory flooding back. "Little Caroline? But you were just a baby, a small girl with big eyes who read medical books. I grew up. Your mama, she died so young. I heard about it, even after you left. We all felt, so bad, the way the town treated her, thinking she was on drugs when she was just sick." Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. "We were wrong. We were cruel." Caroline felt the old anger stir, the resentment she'd carried for decades about a town that had condemned her mother without understanding, that had stolen Ruth's job and dignity when she needed support most. But standing here now, looking at Mrs. Chen's genuine remorse, Caroline found something unexpected. Forgiveness. "You didn't know," she said simply. "None of you knew. And that's what I've spent my whole life trying to change. Making sure people understand these diseases, so families don't have to suffer the way we did." Mrs. Chen reached out with a shaking hand, tremor of age, not disease, and touched Caroline's face. "Your mama would be so proud. I read about you in the newspaper, about the award. Our little Caroline saving people." They stood together on the sidewalk where Carolyn had once walked home from school, where Ruth had once carried groceries on trembling arms, where a whole lifetime of struggle had unfolded in a town too small to hold secrets, but too quick to judge. "I need to tell you something," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "After your mama died, we all felt terrible. The church took up a collection for you, sent it to that doctor in Lexington who was taking care of you. Did you know that?" Caroline shook her head, stunned. $500. It wasn't much, but it was everything people could spare. "We wanted to help, even though it was too late to help Ruth. We wanted you to know that we were sorry. The town had tried to make amends. Caroline had never known, had spent 44 years carrying anger about a place that had actually, quietly, tried to offer restitution. Thank you for telling me that," she whispered. She spent the afternoon walking through Hazard, visiting the cemetery where Ruth wasn't buried. Her mother's body had gone to science. Her grave was in Lexington, but where Caroline stood anyway, among the markers of coal miners and shopkeepers, remembering. Then she drove back to Lexington as the sun set over eastern Kentucky hills, the landscape golden with autumn light. In her office the next morning, Caroline reviewed the latest clinical trial data. Compound 74 had now been approved by the FDA for treatment of progressive supranuclear palsy and 3 related movement disorders. Over 1,500 patients were currently receiving treatment, their disease progression slowed by an average of 60%. 1,500 people who would live longer, suffer less, have more time with their families. 1,500 victories in the war her mother had died fighting. But Caroline wasn't finished. The compound slowed progression but didn't stop it, didn't reverse damage already done. There was still work to do, still mysteries to unravel about why proteins misfolded in the first place, how to prevent the cascade before it started, how to achieve not just management, but cure. At 54 years old, Caroline Holloway had devoted her entire adult life to keeping a promise she'd made as a 10-year-old child. She'd sacrificed relationships, bypassed marriage and children of her own, poured everything into research that had finally borne fruit. Was it worth it? She thought of Ruth's letter, still kept in her desk drawer, the paper soft from decades of handling. Thought of Dr. Ellis reading in her armchair, peaceful in her final moment. Thought of the 1,500 patients who were alive today because of work that had started with a poor single mother in a Kentucky diner, hiding shaking hands and working double shifts to give her daughter a future. It was worth it. That evening, Caroline received a call from Maya Chen, the graduate student whose observation had sparked the breakthrough 5 years earlier. "Dr. Holloway, I wanted you to know I'm pregnant. Due in April." Caroline smiled. "That's wonderful, Maya. Congratulations." "The thing is," Maya's voice wavered, "I found out I carried the genetic markers for early onset Parkinson's. There's an 80% chance I'll develop it by age 50. But because of compound 74, because of the work we did, when that happens, I'll have treatment. I'll be able to watch my kid grow up." The promise had multiplied. One mother's sacrifice had led to one daughter's determination, had led to thousands of families receiving hope they never would have had otherwise. This was legacy. This was love transformed into action. This was what it meant to keep fighting even when you knew you'd lose. Because sometimes losing a battle meant winning the war for everyone who came after. Caroline hung up the phone and returned to her research, working late into the night like she'd done for 44 years, driven by a promise that would never fully be fulfilled, but would never stop mattering. Outside her window, snow began to fall over Lexington, the first snow of the season, covering the university campus in quiet white. And somewhere in that snow, Caroline imagined she could hear her mother's voice, proud and grateful, telling her to rest now, that she'd done enough. But there was still more to do. Caroline Holloway retired from active research in 2023 at the age of 63, though retirement was a generous term for what was actually a shift in focus. She'd spent 53 years studying neurodegenerative disease, first as a child taking notes in her mother's sick room, then as Dr. Ellis's protege, finally as a leading researcher whose work had transformed treatment for thousands of patients worldwide. Compound 74 had evolved into a family of related drugs, each targeting different aspects of protein misfolding, each pushing survival rates higher and quality of life better. Progressive supranuclear palsy was no longer a death sentence within 5 to 7 years. Patients now lived an average of 15 years post-diagnosis, many with minimal symptoms for the first decade. Not a cure, but close enough that families had time. Time to say the things that needed saying. Time to make memories. Time to prepare instead of being ambushed by sudden deterioration. Time was the gift Ruth had never received. On what would have been Ruth Holloway's 84th birthday, Caroline returned to Hazard one final time. The town had continued its slow evolution. The coal industry mostly gone now, replaced by tourism and small manufacturing. The population half what it had been in the 1960s. The Bluebird Diner had finally closed, the building converted into a coffee shop that served lattes instead of the bitter diner coffee Ruth had poured for exhausted truck drivers. But Caroline wasn't here for nostalgia. She was here to dedicate something new. The Ruth Holloway Community Health Clinic opened on October 15, 2023, in a renovated building on Main Street. Caroline had funded it entirely. $3 million from her accumulated patents and speaking fees, creating a facility that offered free neurological screening, subsidized treatment for movement disorders, and most importantly, a promise that no one would be turned away for inability to pay. The waiting room featured a photograph of Ruth at 29, before the disease had ravaged her, smiling in her waitress uniform outside the Bluebird Diner. Beneath it, a plaque read, Ruth Holloway, 1939-1970, who taught us that love means fighting even when you know you'll lose, and that one person's courage can change the world. Mayor Thompson, young enough to have no memory of Ruth, but old enough to understand the clinic's significance, gave a speech about community and second chances and the importance of caring for vulnerable populations. Caroline barely heard it. She was watching the faces in the crowd. Elderly people who remembered Ruth and had lived with their judgment for 50 years. Middle-aged residents who'd heard the stories. Young families who'd come because healthcare was scarce in eastern Kentucky, and free care was rarer still. After the ribbon cutting, an old man approached her, leaning heavily on a cane, his hands trembling with age or disease or both. "You probably don't remember me," he said. "Frank Cutler. I was a deputy sheriff when your mama worked at the Bluebird." Caroline remembered. The man who'd asked Ruth if she was using drugs, whose suspicion had helped poison the town's opinion. "I remember. I need to tell you something I should have said 50 years ago." Frank's voice was rough with emotion. "I was wrong about your mama. I saw what I expected to see instead of asking what was really happening. And by the time I figured out she was sick, not using, it was too late to make it right." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, hands shaking as he offered it to Caroline. "I've been saving this for 30 years, hoping I'd get the chance to give it to you. It's not enough. Nothing could be enough. But it's what I can do." Inside was a check for $50,000. "My pension," Frank explained. "I never married, never had kids. This seems like the right place for it. For your mama's clinic. So maybe some other family doesn't go through what you went through." Caroline looked at this old man, this former deputy who'd carried his guilt for half a century, who was offering everything he had as penance for a mistake made in ignorance. "Thank you," she said quietly. "And Frank, she forgave you. My mama wasn't the type to hold grudges. She would have understood." Frank Cutler cried then, openly and without shame, and Caroline held his shaking hands and forgave him on behalf of the mother who couldn't. The clinic opened for business the next Monday, staffed by young doctors Caroline had personally recruited, equipped with the latest diagnostic technology, stocked with Compound 74, and its successors available at no cost to patients who couldn't afford it. In its first week, they screened 43 people for neurological disorders. They found early signs of Parkinson's in 6, treated them immediately, changed the trajectory of their lives before the disease could steal their mobility. 6 people who would keep their futures. Caroline received updates weekly from the clinic director, reading each case summary with the careful attention she'd once given to research data. These weren't just statistics anymore. They were Mrs. Patterson, 72, whose tremor was caught early enough that medication fully controlled it. Mr. Thompson, 47, whose progressive supranuclear palsy diagnosis came with immediate treatment that would give him years he wouldn't have had a decade earlier. Young Sarah Chen, Maya's daughter, now 13, who'd come in for a screening and been given a clean bill of neurological health, despite her family history. One by one, families were being spared the nightmare Caroline had lived through. One by one, Ruth's death was being transformed into meaning. On a cold December evening, Caroline sat in her Lexington office, soon to be packed up, her formal retirement finally taking effect, and pulled out her mother's letter one last time. The paper was translucent with age now, the ink faded, Ruth's shaking handwriting barely legible in places. But Caroline knew every word by heart. had carried them like a prayer for 53 years. Don't let my death be meaningless. Let it teach you. Let it drive you. Let it make you into the person who saves the next mother, the next daughter, the next family facing what we've faced. I did it, Mama, Caroline whispered to the empty room. It took my whole life, but I did it. And for the first time since Ruth's death in 1970, Caroline allowed herself to rest, knowing the promise was kept. The work would continue without her, the legacy secured. The snow fell again that night over Lexington, soft and quiet, covering the university campus, where Caroline had spent 4 decades in laboratories and lecture halls. She stood at her window, watching it accumulate, remembering another snowfall 53 years earlier when she'd been a terrified 10-year-old, wondering how to survive her mother's death. She'd done more than survive. She'd transformed grief into purpose, loss into legacy, one woman's tragedy into thousands of families' hope. The cure had arrived too late for Ruth Holloway, but it was right on time for everyone who came after. They say in Hazard, Kentucky, on quiet winter nights when the snow falls soft over the mountains, you can still see a light burning in the Ruth Holloway Community Health Clinic, a light that never goes out, tended by doctors who work late into the night, driven by the same promise a 10-year-old girl made to her dying mother 53 years ago. The promise that love, transformed into action, could change the world. And it did. If this story moved you, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And remember, every great change in the world started with one person who refused to accept that things had to stay broken. Sometimes that person could be you.